Hey everyone, Cursed Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks. And right now we've got a Rashmi Eternities Crafter deck. This deck comes to us from Andre, who says that he's trying to steer away from the obvious policing deck, where you just counter what everyone plays, and more into using library manipulation to set up big cheat turns, like casting Treasure Cruise into cheating out a Jin Cataxias. But pushing on that theme too hard tends to involve an overdependence on the commander, which makes the strategy fragile. They didn't say anything about a budget, and the deck itself already has a pretty high budget, but I don't think we need to rank it like ratchet up any higher. And I think they have a really good point on a direction of the deck that could be problematic, and we're going to explore that direction and see what we can do to make it a little stronger and a little more consistent. As always, this deck list is in the video description below, and I highly recommend that you open it up. Take a look before we go any further, see what you would change, see what you think about the deck. In fact, I think this is a fun way to see new decks. One of my favorite parts about this channel is the large variety of decks I get to look at. So, take a look, see if you like it, and see if you have any ideas that I haven't thought of. You can put it in the comments below so that together we can make this deck just a little stronger. So who is Rashmi and what do they do? Rashmi is a 4 mana blue green 2/3 elf druid, and her ability says that whenever you cast your first spell each turn, you reveal the top card. If it's a non-land card with converted mana cost less than the spells, you can cast it, and if it isn't, or you don't cast it, you put it into your hand. All this to say is at the floor, every time you cast the first spell you cast each turn, you get to draw a card. And I think that's particularly good, with the ceiling being that you get to chain spells where you can cast a 3 mana spell and get a free 1 mana spell, let's say, out of the deal. So, how do we make this happen? Well, this deck has a lot of like the core setup to do so. What we have is a lot of flash cards. We have a lot of instants that will go off on your opponent's turns. And we have ways to buy back that mana with Wilderness Reclamation and Seedborn Muse to ensure that on our opponent's turns we have the ability to do things and to keep getting triggers. We also have, where are they? A little bit of top manipulation from Brainstorm to Sylvan Library to Ponder and Preordain. These cards are really, really strong here because they let us set up our next few draws and go for a kind of cascading effect. This is like a cascade deck, is the way I recommend looking at it. But unlike Cascade, instead of getting, almost a guaranteed card out of it to cast, you get at least a guaranteed draw, which it's hard to measure how much stronger or weaker it is because this requires less building around than Cascade, but obviously the power is a little less strong. So the current build of the deck, actually, let's take a quick look at the curve. I'm already impressed by it. Now it's a little deceptive, but also correct in its ways. Where is it? Treasure Cruise is marked as 1 blue, and Dig Through Time is marked as 2 blue. Well, just 2 actually. But what's interesting about that is though I appreciate that to look at the curve to kind of objectively see it, um, it's also a little incorrect because when we think of Treasure Cruise, we actually need it to be, is it 9 mana or 8 mana? 8 mana. We actually need it to be here because with that, we can cast Jin Cataxias. With that, we can cast Seasons Past, right? And so we should be treating it as an 8 mana. So we're just going to keep that in mind. The curve is very nice. 1 mana is very, very high. I think that's to be expected. And 2 mana is also very high, once again, to be expected. Mainly because there's some really strong counter magic and interaction here. Now, as Andre said, he's feeling like the deck is too reactive. It's too policing. Its main way of getting through the game is by shutting down its opponents and winning through kind of a grind out by card advantage with a few bombs here, such as Mind Dilation and Jing Taxius, that put the deck very far ahead. And Mind's Dilation indeed is a very powerful card. If you can resolve Mind's Dilation and protect it, the advantage you'll be gaining is actually pretty substantial, right? Um, and so I like that. I like this build of it, but I understand why this is a problem. And the reason is that there's two main problems with it. The first one is particularly simple in the sense that if you're trying to police three different players, you're going to run out of resources. Even if you're drawing, let's say, an extra card per turn, holding up Dispel to to counter something when you have two other opponents to deal with is not what I would consider an ideal scenario. Also, with Rashmi's kind of um, in the way she works is you reveal the card, and traditionally that's not the worst thing. Like I play Dark Confidant, and I'm never upset that my opponents have that information 90% of the time. Sometimes I will flip a reactive spell like Ink Shield, and it will, one, hurt me a lot, but two, really frustratingly make it hard for me to use that spell, as all my opponents now have the knowledge that I have an incredibly reactive spell. With Rashmi, you actually have a really high collection of these reactive spells, and so your opponents learn how to play around you, and you're playing a losing game when you have to play around their knowledge, and you're playing around the fact you have three opponents with different counter, like with only like one counter spell. The other problem, which I think is very nominal, is that there's a point that we need to trigger Rashmi, right? We need to trigger Rashmi because otherwise we're getting behind on board and card advantage. If this deck doesn't actually use all its mana in a turn cycle, it like one spell per turn, let's say, it's actually losing a lot of the card advantage, which is the reason you're playing this deck. So when you have a spell like Offer You Can't Refuse, and it's one of your only instant speed spells early in the game, you're actually very incentivized to use it because it's the only way you're going to trigger Rashmi, and it's the only way you're going to draw a card. Once again, the one mana cards, we're not expecting, you can't actually cast anything outside of Everflowing Chalice. So with that in mind, you just gotta, right? You just gotta use it, and you just gotta accept the fact that all this says on it is that an additional line of text that says reveal the top card, put it in your hand. And I'm going to suggest that a card like the an Offer You Can't Refuse is awful when you don't have a choice to cast it, right? An Offer You Can't Refuse is really good at winning counterspell wars, and it is atrocious as a proactive play to just knock someone off a spell one turn. Like, don't get me wrong, if I'm casting Smothering Tithe and you respond with an Offer You Can't Refuse, yeah, that sucks. That does really suck. I've spent 4 mana, you spent one, my really powerful enchantment has been countered, and I'm actually on the I'm behind in that sense. But then you think about the fact that you gave me the two treasures, and then it's kind of like, well, that's a pretty good consolation prize. And I've gone from, being down 4 mana to being down 2 mana. I have the treasures I need that maybe I wanted to ramp into something. Like, you've lost an Offer You Can't Refuse, which is probably much better to stop my reanimation combo, let's say. It doesn't feel great, right? So with those two things in mind, I am very much so a fan of saying, let's cut out a lot of the more polarizing counter magic. And by that, I would specify the 1 mana ones first because they can't trigger anything off of it. And then, of course, Swan. After that, we can take a look at something like Delay, which is strong, but definitely the weaker of the counter spells, and Remand as well. Like Delay is really, really strong on 1v1 when you close the game, but delaying, a big bomb. Commander games don't go that long, so you may as well say it's gone forever. But like, it's not counterspell. It's not just saying no. It's not mana drain, which is obviously the strongest one here. Also, Remand feels a little strange, but there's some cuteness with it. Force of Negation is fine because you can still just cast it. But I would look at these low mana ones, and I would especially look at them, even cards like Veil of Summer, where you got to think to yourself, hey, if I flip this off of a Rashmi trigger, is there any purpose in casting it? And the more of these you have, the worse. Like, because you want to be able to cast the top card. That's the full value. Otherwise, whenever Veil of Summer is on top of your deck, you even though you are casting a 2 mana or higher spell, which is technically the hoop you need to jump through to get Rashmi to work, it doesn't it doesn't work, right? You get the floor of putting the card in your hand. Okay. I'm not going to go too much in what cards to remove because I think it's actually kind of more straightforward, and I'll let Andre deal with that. Um, what I'm also going to point out is, interestingly enough, we're kind of light on lands for a deck that has 7 mana enchantments and 7 mana spells. And I don't think this deck shouldn't be playing those spells because this version of the deck we should be building needs to be able to close the game. And with that in mind, I want a little more ramp and a little more lands. It doesn't need to be too much. And what I'm going to suggest first and foremost is our instant speed ramp, because having 1 or 2 more of these is going to be particularly strong because it's going to work with Rashmi very well. So let's put in Rashmi. Let's say search land battlefield. So what are our options? Crop rotation feels a little too intense. I don't think we really have a spell we particularly like, a land that's worth 2 lands in any way. So we're going to ignore that. Entish Restoration is new, so I haven't seen this. Sacrifice a land, search your library for 2 basics, put them on the battlefield tapped. If you control a creature with power 4 or greater, instead 3 basic lands. Do we have creatures 4 power or greater? Not really. So this feels like another Harrow, and Roiling Regrowth is also another Harrow. I would play Harrow first because Harrow is instant and the 2 basics come in untapped, which then lets you hold up mana on your next turn. So it's weirdly mana fixing, mana ramp, and enabling Rashmi another cast on the next turn. So I would definitely play Harrow, and then I would leave it up to you if you want to play. Okay, it's sorcery that instant. Roiling Regrowth or Entish Restoration. Both of them are cute. The fact the lands come in tapped, it's not ideal. Obviously, the other ones that I like more, Growth Spiral is already here, and I believe there's one more that is Growth Spiral, but at 4 mana, and you draw 2 cards. Land, hand, battlefield. Eureka moment. Draw 2 cards, you can put a land card from your hand on the battlefield. That's fine. I like this as a draw 2. I think this is a very decent card that people underestimate because it's just, you know, adding 2 mana to Growth Spiral to draw an extra card, I think is very reasonable. And at 4 mana, you have even a higher chance of hitting another card in your deck that you can cast off of. But with that in mind, a little bit of ramp I think would go a long way. I think depending, you could put more mana rocks as well, but we are in green, so with Farseek, Rampant Growth, 3 visits, I think there should be at least one more 2 mana card. I can't think of it. You can even play Explore here, I think would be fine. So these cards are good, and playing one or two more of them with like a 3 mana one and like a 2 mana one. You could play 1 mana creatures, but they feel kind of off theme a little bit. I'm unsure. Rashmi lets you still cast them, so that's fine. But generally, you want instants more. So I'll leave that up to you. Like a bird of paradise, and like a gilded goose, for example, would be fine. Like those two, just to play them and see how they do. And I would probably like them a little more than Sakura Tribe Elder, who feels like he doesn't really belong here because this isn't a graveyard-based deck or a sacrifice deck. Okay, so what's the next idea? The next idea is that we need other finishers, right? Right now our finisher is Mind's Dilation and Jin Cataxias. Otherwise, we're going to grind our opponents out and attack with, uh, I guess, like small creatures, right? The goal really is to like play Jin Cataxias and protect him, or Mind's Dilation and protect him, and use those cards to defeat our opponents. I think we could have a few more of these kind of things. And I think the easiest one that comes to mind is, I'm looking at the wrong program, Shark Typhoon. Shark Typhoon's great because when you cast it, you're going to get a pretty good Rashmi trigger, and it's going to represent a very consistent board that you're putting out of creatures, mainly because you're going to, especially like once per each turn. One of the things that makes Shark Typhoon a little bad in multiplayer is that you have to, if you kind of cast all the spells at once, you kind of reveal your whole hand to make an army. But if you're going to, like, this just rewards you for casting another card each turn. And even if you're casting your smaller cards and getting 1/1s or 2/2s, that's fine because they're going to add up incredibly fast. Because this is now a investment that you never need to put more mana into, and it pays you off for doing what you want. Now, what you want to be doing. Now, obviously, 6 mana is a lot, but as we know, it has a cycling cost to make up for this. So I don't think it's particularly bad in that sense. Like I think it's really strong that it can play in any means. Like it's very malleable for what you want it to do. So I would add that for sure as one of our main win conditions. And then what I wouldn't mind, we're going to combine two ideas. One idea is that we need late mana cards that win us games or put us very far ahead. And the second idea is we need to replace Rashmi should she be hated out of the game or just, you know, for one reason or another, she is unable to do what we want her to do. So the two cards that immediately come to mind, and I wouldn't play both, I would play one or the other. Future Sight cleanly lets you just cast cards off the top of your deck. What makes this really, really nice is that it kind of works on the same basis of Rashmi, where you're using a lot of cards with Scry or manipulating your top deck. And so Future Sight gets a lot stronger when you do that, and you can constantly just play off the top of your deck. Now, I wasn't going to suggest this, but I will anyways. Reality Chip does the same thing, but considerably less. Like the mana is cut in half. You're I think it's one less blue to do so. But of course, it doesn't work the same way. You may play the top card, yeah, because you need this attached to a creature, and you are kind of low on creatures. And it's funny because I could say, well, you do have a creature, you have Rashmi. But if you have Rashmi, you don't need the reality chip? I don't know. I would think about this. I would give this a little bit of thought over Future Sight. I would play either Future Sight or Reality Chip, and then alternatively to those two, I would play, I think it's one with the multiverse, which is some real modern day superhero movie titling. But this one has, so it has the same idea where the first two lines of text are the same. And then it says, once per each of your turns, you may cast a spell from your hand at the top of the library without paying its mana cost. So once again, this works really well with and without Rashmi. Like all of these cards, when Rashmi's out, get even stronger. And when Rashmi is not out, they kind of give you a pseudo Rashmi, right? One with the multiverse is a lot of mana. And I think it's not that bad considering if we put a little more ramp, it shouldn't be that hard to get to that level of to 8 mana. But it does represent a pretty good end game scenario where on your turns you get a free spell and you get to hold up the rest of your mana for the rest of your opponent's turns to basically, you know, pass through their turns and cast an extra spell each time. So I really, really like that. And the one other one on this note you could possibly say is As Foretold. Um, I don't know if I particularly love this because it takes a really long time for this card to do anything. But objectively, if you could use a mana dork to play it on turn 2 or like a soul ring to play it on turn 2, and then starting turn 3, you start ticking this up. and you play it with the idea that you're only going to get one or two counters on it, it's not bad, right? Once again, Rashmi doesn't care how much mana you've spent on it. It just cares about the converted mana cost, which As Foretold doesn't play around with. Now, As Foretold is also here to, you know, make our transition to a few spells that we should be considering. We should actually put like this, including these colors. Let's just go with blue first, then we'll look at green. Let's look at our quote unquote free spells. I think we should probably have one in each of these. Ancestral Vision is mainly the one in white, in blue, where if you can cast this off the top of your deck, which you can with any spell, right? Because it's 0 mana, you'll draw 3 cards. That's not as great of a payoff as it is in 1v1, but it is here. You can always suspend it. It takes a while, but you can suspend it early in the game. That's fine. Inevitable Betrayal looks a lot better in Commander than it does in one-on-one formats because you're guaranteed to pull at least one ridiculous creature out. Like, I'm thinking about the majority of my decks will have one creature that is particularly swingy. Like, you can pull Al Schnorn out of one of my decks, or you can pull out like a big demon, or if you even wanted, you could just grab like Dark Confidant, Timna, a utility creature that puts you very far ahead, right? But that's just me at the table. You have three other opponents, and with two other opponents besides me, and each of those players might have a very, very strong card. If one of your friends shows up with an Eldrazi deck, well, you know who you're targeting with this. So I like this. Suspend 3 isn't bad. It's a lot of mana for 3 mana for this, but it does work very strong. And then if we swap into green, of course, we're going to have access to Crashing Footballs, which is 2/4/4s, not as good as one-on-one, but it is fine. Hypergenesis, which I believe is legal in Commander, it is, which says that each player can basically put out all their permanents from their hand onto the battlefield. I don't know if this deck wants this, but technically, if you put yourself in a good position, you can make the most of it because it's likely you have the biggest hand. And then Gaia's Will also stands out to me, which lets you play lands and cast spells. It's Yawgmoth's Will, but in green, and I think you get to play lands as well. This one is really cool to me. I would maybe consider this because I think it'll let you get a lot of value. I look at cards like, I guess it doesn't as much because you have to cast them all the same turn, but it can buy back a particularly good card from your deck. I don't know. This could be fine. It could be fine. It works in the same way as Seasons Pass, where you're going to cast a bunch of your spells back and reap the rewards of doing so. And at worst, you can just cast Ponder again, cast Preordain again, cast Opt again, and just put yourself up a few cards, which is particularly strong, and then move on, over the next few turns. Especially if you I guess maybe because if you use Rashmi to cast this on your opponent's turn, you might not have the means to cast the sorceries. Okay, maybe I'm a little medium on this, but I wanted to put it here anyways, just as an example, as a kind of card that costs 0 mana that you could be playing. I'm thinking mostly of Inevitable Betrayal here, and then maybe Crashing Footballs, as it is a way to put some threats onto the battlefield. And 8 power is not nothing. It is 5 attacks to defeat a fully healthy opponent. After that, the things I want to think about, I'm trying to think of any other kind of closing situation, and I think that's really it. I'm sure there's a few enchantments that let you mill, but I don't think. I remember someone saying the new Storm card, Storm of, I think it's Sauron or Saruman. Storm of Saruman. That's 6 mana. That's whenever you cast your second spell each turn, copy it, except for the copy isn't legendary. This is cute. This is really cute. I like it because it works strangely parallel with your commander, where your commander wants to cast that first spell, and then this wants you to cast that second spell. And Rashmi enables you to cast the second spell because you don't copy it into play. you cast it. So it lets you turn one spell into three, and I think that's neat. And I think you can still use Storm of Saruman as a regular spell to just get ahead. Additionally, of that, in that mind, casting anything I think that puts you very far ahead or functions as a board clear could be good here. Fractal, right? Fractal. It's not divide by zero. It's something like that. Oversimplify is the board clear within your colors. It's not perfect, but it functions. Lets you put some creatures out, I believe, each player, which is the total power. Okay, that's fine. But after that, something I want to quickly talk about is a little bit more protection for Rashmi. So we can kind of make Rashmi redundant, but I also wouldn't mind something like slip out the back that will phase Rashmi out, get your Rashmi trigger, and then protect her from a board clear or removal. I think that's fine. And then we can look into any. You're already playing Veil of Summer, which I think is probably going to be the best one, but anything at 1 mana in blue that gives hexproof, which actually there might be a few more in green. Hexproof 1. Playing another one of these, any of these is fine, really, right? I think the newest one that people really like was Shore Up. Gives +1/+1, hexproof, and untap. I think that's fine. They're all fine. Tyvar's stand is probably the best one because it gives indestructible as well. And I don't think any of the other ones do that. And Veil of Summer is generally good too, so I wouldn't mind having both of them. But once again, it's kind of tough because these are kind of blanks on top of your deck. At least Phase Out can be used proactively to take one of your opponent's threats out of the game, even if you give a +1/+1 counter on it, right? Is you can phase something out to prevent an attack. You can phase something out to open up a weakness. So your other opponent, let's say, I'm the player that played before you, so I'm furthest in the player chain on your turn, or on someone else's turn. You can slip out the back of my blocker and look at your other two opponents and say, hey, you should be attacking into Cursed Deck Builder because he's a jerk and deserves it. So that can be particularly powerful there. And then the last thing I want to think about really briefly is Magecraft, and if there's any other Magecraft we should be playing. Talrand, I believe, is the other one that comes to mind, which I'll put out here. Talrand, yeah. Who just represents, creating a bunch of tokens, like a Monastery Mentor kind of setup, which will be another way for you to push out ahead. And here, Archmage, you're already playing. Dragon's Guard Elite is interesting because it grows really fast, but it's fine. Dika feels like just another version of the Shark Typhoon, so I don't like it as much. Quandrix is okay. I would say maybe just Talrand here. But I will say a bit of warning. Before I say it, there's also Chrome Host Sea Shark with Seed Shark, which is close, but not exactly the same thing. I would play this in a deck that could take advantage of having artifacts more than take advantage of the incubate, because it's a lot of mana. However, you are playing a deck that uses cards that untap all your lands, so it's not crazy for you to have enough mana to flip the incubation creatures. So I'm also not against this. But both the Seed Shark and Talrand come with like a bit of a warning. I was just talking with a friend about this last night, but one of the scariest things you can do in Commander is have a lot of triggers. Now I want to be clear, I didn't say the strongest. I said the scariest. My friend was playing the new Hobbit deck from Lord of the Rings, and that deck has so many triggers just constantly. Every time you eat a food, every time you attack, every time what was it, the ring tempts you. There's so many things going on. And though objectively in the game we played, it wasn't, the most powerful thing, he was actually probably furthest behind, and this was not really pulling him ahead. It was catching everyone's attention, right? And that's what you don't want. You don't want to put your finger on the scale more than you have to. You want to go a little, you want to sneak in a little bit and have people kind of not be sure how strong you are. Rashmi does this pretty well because though you're casting something on each of your opponent's turns, a lot of the card advantage goes into your hand. So it's kind of hard for them to look down and see like whether or not you're winning. But that being said, you are already casting something on each of your opponent's turns. You already are getting their attention. Be careful with these effects because you're just going to do it more. There's just going to be more and more triggers, more and more effects, and you're going to get everyone's attention. So what I do like about Chrome Host, Seed Shark, and Talrand is that Shark Typhoon is that they represent a very quick shift from playing defensively to becoming the threat. Because within one turn cycle, you might have enough an army to pose a threat, and especially with Shark Typhoon, you have a army, and to an extent, the Seed Shark, you have an army that survives through board clears, so it's particularly strong. And one more card that I saw, I don't think I'm going to suggest this, but Koma the Chaos Serpent, Cosmos Serpent, works very similarly in this deck. It's you land it and you leave it, much like Jin Cataxius, except for Koma has its own protection. Koma triggers on each turn, and Koma just kind of builds itself into being a very, very strong threat that you don't need to really spend a lot of energy in. And at 7 mana, you're going to be almost guaranteed that if you flip a spell, that you will get it. So these are kind of my suggestions. I think once again, looking here, the transition I would like is to add some proactive, win conditions so your deck can close games, and remove some of the, like a lot of the permission that's more themed towards higher level play. Because if you don't want to be the police, you got to get rid of cards like an offer you can't refuse. But that doesn't mean you should be getting rid of Counterspell or Arcane Denial or Mana Drain, right? Muddle the Mixture even is really strong as a tutor. Like, these spells are strong, and with them, you can cast other spells out of them. It's just the narrow ones we don't want as much. Because the narrow ones put you into uncomfortable positions where you have to start casting spells that you really want to hold on to for most of the game. And then, at least for me, adding in a few instant speed ramps or adding a few like lower mana ramp, like a mana dork or two, can help you get a little further and get to higher mana quicker. If Rashmi put the land into play, my goodness, I would love her. But unfortunately, she doesn't. So you're still restricted to playing lands fairly most of the time, and something like the instant speed, which I can't remember what it's called now. Something like Eureka Moment, or well, I think it's gone forever. But the other lands that come into play instantly at instant speed are particularly powerful here because they let you hold up the mana, let you trigger a Rashmi, and they let you just do what you wanted to do and get ahead without tapping out on your turn. And then, yeah, finally having a few redundancies for Rashmi, such as one with the multiverse or future sight will be particularly good. Reality chip is still on my mind, but things like that. And I think the deck will be stronger in the direction you want it to be stronger. And I think you'll have the ability to close out games quickly, which I think is the strongest thing in a deck like this. Rashmi's card advantage engine doesn't necessarily get better over time. That's a weird thing to say. You might be thinking, okay, if I'm quote unquote drawing 3 cards, 4 cards a turn cycle, which gets easier and easier to do with more and more cards, you know, this is an engine that gets stronger and better as the game progresses. But that's not entirely true because as the games go longer and your opponent's engines themselves turn on, you it becomes a lot harder for you to be able to hold up counter magic or deal with what they're doing and still get all the Rashmi triggers. Like I think of Brina, who through a turn cycle, if I can get my opponents to attack each other, will draw me a bunch of cards, and then it'll come back to me, and I'll have a really big Brina, and I'll have a handful of cards. So I'm already in a position like each turn that goes by, I'm getting stronger, and I can set up more and more for an infinite combo or any other way to win the game. And I'm not reliant on Brina after a while. Whereas Rashmi, because you're constantly casting spells, you need to keep casting spells to keep drawing the more cards to trigger Rashmi again. Which once again, that's why my whole idea was to say let's play cards like Shark Typhoon because they're just going to benefit that you're in this cycle and just give you another bonus for it. Well, I hope this was particularly helpful. This video went a lot longer than I expected it to, but I do like this deck and I want to give it specific ideas. If you have another draft of this deck or any deck you'd like me to take a look at, please send it to me. There is a form in the video description and the YouTube channel subscription description. And I'd love it if you could subscription, as I said before. You could subscribe, like, comment, do the whole YouTube thing. It's very helpful for the channel, and I would appreciate your support. All right, thanks a lot and good luck.